Wednesday, Mike Hall, Jerry DiNardo, and Howard Griffith, along with recruiting expert Alan True, bringing you 3 hours of analysis covering the entire conference on Big Ten Live, the signing day special, 2 Eastern on the Big Ten Network and the Fox Sports app. Here's how the classes are shaping up according to the 247 composite rankings. Ohio State leading the way, the only top 10 class in the conference as of now. Penn State and Michigan both in the top 20. Iowa, Michigan State, Northwestern, and Maryland rounding out the top half of the conference. Let's get into today's big interview. It is Ari Wasserman who covers recruiting as well as college football in general. Sure, on the Big Ten. Looked at the rankings there a moment ago, just 3 top 20 classes. How do you feel like the Big Ten has fared in this cycle?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the way that the Big Ten rankings tend to come out, you have 3 Big Ten East teams in the top 20, and the rest of the conference is kind of looking up. And I think part of the reason for that is the more established brands, the powerhouses of the conference, have an easier. They've got better brands. They've got ability to go nationally. And, I think that's kind of the hardest thing about the Big Ten and the way that the divisions are set up right now. It's that you have the most advantageous recruiting geography on one end of the spectrum. And on the other end of the spectrum, you're kind of in no man's land where there aren't a lot of players that are, there for the taking. So the fact of the matter is that this is going to continue to happen, not just because of the brands, but because of the geography. And it's like, even like Maryland, for instance, more and they might land a 5-star prospect for like the 3rd or 4th year in a row coming up on Wednesday. So, big picture, I think that this is kind of the way that it is, and I'm very curious to see how the conference will look and the inevitability of no divisions anymore.
Let me ask you this, Ari. Does this matter as much anymore given the transfer portal era? I mean, obviously recruiting is part of how you stock your program, but it does feel like the portal gives you the opportunity to plug in holes in a way that you didn't have before. How would you weigh the relative importance of recruiting now versus, let's say, even 3 or 4 years ago?
Yeah, Dave, anybody who's followed my work in any regard over the course of the past, few years since I went from the Ohio State beat to being a national reporter is, my mantra is stars matter, and the importance of stars and the way that you accumulate talent in college football is, I think 80 or 85% of the job as it pertains to, what a coach is supposed to be doing. And what I've been struggling with, or maybe not struggling with, but, preparing myself for is the fact that these recruiting rankings are going to mean less and less. And, I think that, it'd be hard not to acknowledge what Michigan's doing in the portal right now. I think they just got 5 players over the weekend in the portal to mask what has been a pretty underwhelming recruiting class for them coming off of their first, playoff appearance last year. They are ready to play and play, and they've been very good in the portal. How do you analyze that? Do you analyze Michigan as well? They had an underwhelming class during a year in which Jim Harbaugh was flirting with the NFL, and they never really got back on track. Or do you think it's a great year because they brought 5 guys in that are probably better than whatever freshmen they would have gotten who can play right away and have an impact on this team? And as we go forward, I think there has to be a system or some sort of way of analyzing a talent accumulation as a whole, not just recruiting rankings, but just every player that comes and goes, in a given year, because it's getting more and more hard to predict who's going to win a national championship or who are going to be the best teams in the country based on the portal and how quickly players are coming and going.
Let's dive into a few of these teams specifically. And let's start with Ohio State. They're first in the Big Ten in recruiting, as they seem to be every year. I did mention the class is ranked 7th right now. They've been top 5 here recently. But when you look at the average recruiting ranking per player, it's actually in the top 3. So they just seem to have a smaller class than some of those other teams in the top 10. Is this still a really good class for Ohio State, or is that 7th ranking significant as opposed to a top 5 in the last few years?
So you're a seasoned veteran. You get it. I think that the ranking a lot of times can be deceiving because people just go and look and say, hey, well, Ohio State has the number 7 class. That's 4 or 5 spots out of the area that they're supposed to be. and they don't really take into account the average player rating, which I believe is 93.46, and it's the third best behind only Alabama. The question with Ohio State is this. Who are they with? And this is kind of ever changing because the last 2 years they've gotten beaten up pretty good by Michigan. But, during my 10 years on the beat, it went from, covering Big Ten recruiting to being a national program. It went from Michigan being the main rival to can they beat Alabama and Georgia? So when you look at this class right now, you have a smaller group, and they still have a few guys they're waiting to hear announcements from, but it's not necessarily on par with what you're going to be seeing from Alabama, who might finish this cycle with 6 5-star prospects, or what Georgia's bringing in. And I think the fear is that, at least from an Ohio State fan perspective, that they are slipping a little bit. And there's an NIL discussion that's happening right now, and the Michigan thing is obviously hanging out over their heads, and they lost a 5-star prospect on Saturday in the quarterback position. So there's two ways of looking at Ohio State. It's like, one, this team is about to be in the playoff. They're playing Georgia. They have an opportunity to win a national championship. And on the other hand, there's a big lack of juice when it comes to the program and where they're headed right now in the recruiting rankings. So I'm excited to see what happens with, 5-star defensive end Mateo Uiagalelei, who, Ohio State feels pretty good about. And if they can get 1 or 2 more splashes to close out this class, I think that would be a little bit better than where things are standing. From a Big Ten perspective, though, it's a very good class.
You mentioned Ohio State. They're waiting on some potential commits here between now and Wednesday. Are there other teams that are waiting on big-time guys that could move significantly between now and Wednesday, given some of the players that might be late declarations or still in flux?
Yeah, I alluded to this earlier in the interview, but 5-star athlete Nicholas Harbor has been at Maryland the last few weeks, and he's making Maryland's trying to make a push. Mike Locksley's had a very good knack of landing 5-star prospects at the end of the cycle. I don't know what's in the secret sauce there, but I think that the bigger challenge for them has been keeping them in the program. But they're in the mix there along with South Carolina and Michigan. So you got a 5-star prospect there that, 2 of the final 3 teams that seem to be alive in his recruitment are Big Ten teams. And of course you got 4-star athlete, Malachi Coleman out of Lincoln, Nebraska. He's committed to Nebraska for, a pretty good amount of time, but then took a surprise visit to Colorado as the entire country is, watching with bated breath to see what Deion Sanders is going to be able to do with that program. And obviously you've got the Matt Rule factor. So those, I think, Mateo Uiagalelei with Ohio State. But Nicholas Harbor, I think, is one of the most interesting prospects remaining on the board because he's just such a immense talent and a versatile player and can do things in the weight room that you would expect from an NFL guy. And, the fact is that Maryland has a shot to get this guy. And, I'm always all for being entertained by the thought process of teams that aren't typically in the mix for big time program changing players, getting them. And I find that to be a fascinating thing to watch out for.
I know we're talking about hundreds of players here who are going to sign on Wednesday, but is there one or are there a few who Big Ten fans should keep an eye on and become aware of their names, maybe in the way that Nicholas Singleton was last year, or some of these other kind of high-profile guys who can make a splash right away?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are always what I think is the most interesting thing, and I'll be honest with you, I sit here and I break down recruiting every single day, and I watch highlight videos and analyze talent and see the rankings and all these things and whether they match up with who they are. The thing that I really love the most here, Dave, is that the Big Ten has had an uncanny ability to get guys that come out of nowhere who were undervalued and turn out to be great players. I mean, look at Illinois' running back this year. I mean, he wasn't a huge recruit or prospect that we would be talking about on a day like this, and he turned out to be one of the best running backs in college football. And there's a lot of players like that are in these classes. I mean, if you go look at Illinois' class right now, they've got 21 commitments and their average player rating is 85.85. It's like, they got the Rico Walker out of North Carolina, who's a top 250 player, but who is going to be at the bottom of that class that really comes out and does something in the next few years? And, I think what Wisconsin has done so many years with some of those offensive linemen and running backs they get in. That I feel like the Big Ten West particularly has been one of the best developing divisions in all of college football. And, who is the big time name that you should be looking out for? What about all the hundreds of names that are being, signed by these programs over a 5-year period that turn out to be really good football, NFL draft eligible players? And that's what's really most exciting to me about this type of day.
You were talking about the portal and Michigan. The Wolverines, of course, focused on recruiting, but also focused on the CFP, the huge game coming up here against TCU. So let's turn our attention there to those two games, starting with Michigan and TCU. What are you focused on here for the Wolverines as they look to not just get into the playoff like they did last year, but advance in the playoff and compete for a national title?
Yeah, you know what I think is interesting about this, Dave, is that I am very beholden to the 247 Sports talent composite rankings, which shows you what talent level each program has. And I think that if you go back and look over the course of the past 20 years, I think only 3 teams have won a national championship without having signed a top 5 class in the previous 4 seasons. And all those were 2 Clemson teams and the Cam Newton Auburn team, but all 3 of those teams had top 10 classes. So when you look at the talent matchup of the first round game here between Michigan and TCU, you don't have a talent matchup that's typical with this stage. Michigan would typically have to go see a team like Georgia or a team like Alabama a month after beating Ohio State. And now they're getting a very good TCU team, but a team that doesn't have the type of talent that you would expect from a national champion. So, when I look at what I would expect from Michigan, it would be for guys like Donovan Edwards and J.J. McCarthy and the 5-star elite level tier talent players that they have in their teams to be the difference. And, Michigan to me is still a few years away of elite level recruiting away from winning a national championship, because even though they beat Ohio State, I don't know that they are in a position to beat Ohio State and Georgia in the same year. But they have a great opportunity to play for a national championship, I think, pretty ahead of schedule. Like when you go back and look at where Jim Harbaugh was 2 years ago, if you would have told me 2 years ago when he took half of his salary and was on the hot seat that he'd be playing in the college football playoff and his team would be favored by double digits, I would have thought you were insane. I mean, I honestly would not have. I would have bet anything that wouldn't happen, and here we are. So, to me, Michigan has a talent advantage in a playoff game, and I'm looking for them to assert their not only the way they play the game and the way they beat Ohio State, but also to use some of that, outstanding playmaking ability to try to advance into the national championship game and be 4 quarters away from a national championship.
It is a remarkable story, Ari, no question about it, from where we were a couple of years ago to where we are now with Michigan. And to think not only are they in the playoff with a talent advantage over the team they're playing, but it's the second straight year they've made it. So it has been a remarkable turnaround for sure. You mentioned Ohio State and Georgia as teams who have really stockpiled talent from a recruiting point of view. And it is interesting that that's the lens through which you see things, because obviously Ohio State, coming off that Michigan game, did not play well and were really dominated at the line of scrimmage. But you think about, from Georgia's point of view, being the number 1 seed in this deal, and then the team you were rewarded with as the 4th seed is Ohio State, who has incredible talent up and down the roster. Can Ohio State's talent rise to that level of Georgia? How do you see this matchup here in terms of whether or not the Buckeyes can kind of play up to the recruiting rankings, for lack of a better way of putting it?
Yeah, that's the weirdest thing about the college football playoff. Is the seeding done in a way like in normal sports where the number 1 overall seed in the country is rewarded with the easiest path, or do they put themselves in a position where they just put the 4 best teams out there and do the best that they can to get the 4 teams in order? Now, Ohio State is in a position right now where they have the talent that can match it, but there's been something off with them, and I don't know if they'll be able to match it up. So, the hardest thing with Ohio State is that if they put it together on any given day, they are a team that is built to beat any other team in college football. There's no question about it. And that is a tough matchup for Georgia, because they would have preferred to play a team that has a 247 Sport composite ranking in the 30s or 40s, like the other two. Michigan's much higher than that, but that what I'm saying is going athlete for athlete, Georgia's getting a really tough opponent. So, my personal opinion is that Ohio State has some issues that you can't fix in a month, and they're probably not going to win that football game, but if they put it together, and we've seen them put it together in the past, they could win that game. And that's going to be an interesting and intriguing matchup to watch for sure. And I think I speak for everybody at this network and everybody who's watching. I think it'd be awesome to see Ohio State and Michigan play again. I mean, that'd be something.
Understatement. It would be absolutely remarkable were that to come to pass. So we shall see. We'll find out on New Year's Eve. Ari, I know this is a busy time for you with signing day coming up here on Wednesday. Appreciate you taking a little time to shed some light on all this for us. Thanks a lot, Ari.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
New AP poll just out in the last few minutes. Purdue remains number one. So first time in school history, they have been number one on successive weeks. You see 3 other Big Ten teams in the poll. Illinois up a couple spots, Wisconsin up 5 spots, and Indiana dropped 4 spots. 4 other Big Ten teams receiving votes. So 8 teams in all getting at least some sort of mention here. Trey, obviously Purdue is the biggest story, no doubt, remaining at number one. Is there some sort of connective tissue in your mind between those other teams that are in the poll?
Yeah, I think it's the third, fourth. At some of these teams that are at 16, 17, Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, because with Illinois, you know what you're going to get with Terrence Shannon Jr. And now Matthew Myers playing at a high level offensively. With Wisconsin, Chucky Hepburn and Tyler Wall are going to be your guys. Indiana, Race and Trace are going to be your guys offensively. But I think the key for all these teams to kind of stay there or even push up a little bit is to get production from the third, fourth, and fifth option. I look at Wisconsin, a guy like Connor Essegian, Jordan Davis, guys like that. Away, Tamar Bates, guys like that. Jordan Geronimo maybe now gets some more minutes. And then for Illinois, I think it's going to be a collective of guys. Some of those freshmen, Melendez, guys like that. I think that's going to be the key moving forward for those teams, is to get those offensive productions from your role players.
Interesting. A number of Big Ten teams in this discussion, and I think this is kind of where we anticipated the league would be, maybe absent Purdue being number one. I don't know that any of us came into the year thinking that was the best team in the country, a team that wasn't ranked in the preseason, but certainly a lot of competitive teams in the Big Ten. And now the question becomes, to your point, who steps up,
right,
who gets better as the year goes on.